All right, here we
Hey,
are.
everybody.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks for having
Thanks for
lunch
being
with
here.
us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you guys for being here. And before I forget to say this, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. And we always
Yes,
forget to talk
please.
about that. So,
I know. We just jump
Scott
right in.
here. Yeah, we just jump right in. We do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Scott here along with Dr. Rachel, and today we're going to talk about trial competency. What we're going to talk about is specifically a couple of different cases that are in the news right now. One is the case of Bianca Ellis, who's
Mhm.
a case out of Ohio that I'll talk about in just a second. And then Dr. Rachel's going to talk about another case as well, a case of Tyler Daisy out of Dubuque, Iowa. And both of those cases involve competency or not competent to talk in
Mhm.
court, essentially. So let me start with the case of Bianca Ellis. So this is a case out of Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, uh, that happened here just this past June, just about a little over a month ago. Essentially, what the case is about, for those of you that don't know about it, this is a lady who had previous contact with the police department in Florida as well as in Ohio. And basically, what she did is she went to a thrift store the day of the incident and stole two very large knives. And then she ended up going into a supermarket where a mother and her 3-year-old son were shopping. The little boy was in the cart. And anyway, there's video of her wandering around the store, the defendant, Bianca Ellis, with the knife down by her side, just walking through the store. It's actually chilling, you guys. If you haven't seen the
Mhm.
video, I'm not really sure. I mean, Rachel and I were just talking a minute ago. I'm not really sure how people didn't see that. I mean, clearly they were just in their
Yeah.
own world. But I mean, this is a huge kitchen knife that really you wouldn't miss probably if you saw somebody holding it.
Mhm.
So anyway, she wanders around the store for a few minutes, and then she sees the mom and the little boy, and she follows them immediately out into the parking lot, ends up stabbing the little boy and stabbing the mom. The little boy
Mhm.
ended up succumbing to his injuries at the age of 3. Mom is still recovering from her injury. She was stabbed in the shoulder.
Mhm.
And so that's essentially the case in itself. Now the
Tragic.
issue,
Tragic.
tragic, yeah, really tragic.
Mhm.
Now the issue of competency has come up, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And so,
Yeah.
um, yeah, Dr. Rachel is the expert in that area. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to you and kind of let you just talk about competency in this case.
Sounds good. Yeah. Right. I'm Queen forensic psychologist, remember?
Yes.
Scott, Derek, uh, um, from Truth or Derek podcast pushed me into that title. So I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, yes, this case is so tragic. I can't even imagine it. It gets even trickier probably in the future. We'll talk about why. Because these are just situations where we have no control. Whatever gap there was, whatever in her maybe treatment or whatever happened to her that brought her to bring this knife or to take these knives and do this, we don't know, and but it has already been done at that point. And so yeah, I don't know if she grabbed the knives from the store. Maybe people just thought she was buying them. I mean, she looked, I think sometimes people are hesitant. Like, she might have looked strange about it, but sometimes people are hesitant because they don't want to accuse somebody of
Mhm.
something if they don't. It's like, I don't know. I mean, I think people are also just on tunnel vision a lot of
Yeah.
times when they're out and about. But anyway, so, and we don't know. Yeah, Lori, we don't know what her diagnosis is. But I can talk a little bit about that when I saw her in court. There are a couple videos in court. Right off the bat, it's very clear to me there's some psychosis going on. I know some people were saying, "Oh my gosh, she's smiling, she's laughing," but her affect, her presentation, the way she held herself was very clear.
Mhm.
She was potentially responding to what we call internal stimuli, hearing voices, with people who are psychotic, we see, that smile, that inappropriate affect of smiling. Sometimes they're responding to voices that they're hearing. So we don't really know her level of impairment, but I can guarantee, I bet a lot of money on it, there's a psychotic disorder going on there. That smiling and laughing wasn't smiling and laughing because, you know, because she thought something was funny that was going on in her circumstances. That wasn't that type of laughter. So, I always think about the victims in these cases and this poor mother. I mean, what it must be like, what happened? Why was this woman walking around floridly psychotic with a knife? We don't know.
Right.
We could do a whole other 18-hour show on that. But at this point now, we know that she's been determined incompetent to stand trial, which is going to cause some delays and things. So when we talk about competency, so I want to make clear, competency is different from insanity. So competency has nothing to do with her defense. It has nothing to do with her defense strategy. The standard for competency is that a person needs to have a sufficient ability to consult with and work with their attorney, and a reasonable, rational understanding of how the legal system works. They need to have a factual understanding of the proceedings. They need to be able to use at least sufficient abstract reasoning to be able to make decisions about their defense. There's a lot that we don't think about that goes into making these kinds of decisions. When you're working with an attorney, when you're in the court system, because it would just be automatic for us. Like, we understand how this all works. We're able to kind of risk and benefit analysis, do risk and benefit analysis. Not everybody is able to do that. And I will say, so I believe it's about 2 to 6 or 8% of felony, those with felony charges are referred for competency evaluations, and much less than that are actually found incompetent. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of agreement among psychologists and people who do these evaluations with any one particular person. So it's very likely that a competency evaluation that I would do, if 10 other psychologists saw that person, there'd be a lot of differences in opinion about competency. So it's not an exact science. I think you stick to the standard evaluations as much as you can with the questions to ask and how to evaluate it. But there's also, I find in the state that I work in, there can be, I don't know if I want to call it political, but if defense attorneys refer their client to me for a competency evaluation, and I may say this person's not competent, well, they might then get sent to the state hospital so that the prosecution can have their own testing done, and they typically, here anyway, say, no, this person's competent, they're fine. So there can be, and that's not because I'm trying to do what's best for the defense. I mean, I'm not making stuff up. I have many evaluations where I say, no, this person's competent. Like, you can't say that. But that's sort of kind of how it ends up going for some reason. So did you have a question, Scott?
I do actually, Rachel. So
Yeah.
one thing, I know very little about this, even having been in law enforcement all those years. So I'm really glad we're talking about this today. My question is, how long does an average competency hearing or test, or whatever, however you want to put it, how long does that generally go? Is it days of evaluation, or how does that work?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on my schedule. I don't know how it works everywhere, but typically within a month of the referral from the attorney, I get the person in to see them. And then within a month or two, I have a report for them. If they're going to move forward with, depending on what my results ended up being. Yeah. That doesn't have anything to do though with when they can get a hearing about it. So, like, I don't have anything to do with that. I mean, that depends on the jurisdiction, but it can definitely delay things. Yeah. So, Sonia, yeah, that's the next thing I'm kind of gonna get to. So, So I'm going to talk about that first, just to preface that. I want to say, so why would an attorney decide, I think we need a competency evaluation? So we'll kind of tie that into what Sonia's question is about, what the parameters are. So there are a lot of different instruments that psychologists can use. I'm not going to go through like the technicalities of each of those, because that will be, not, that won't be helpful. But I'm going to give you sort of generally the things that I use to determine competency. Attorneys may refer someone if, they met with them and the person's not making a whole lot of sense. They don't seem to grasp, the reasons why they were arrested, why they were charged.
Mhm.
They're not able to give sort of factual um, facts about the case in a way that will help the attorney. They might not. They may seem to be of lower intellectual functioning, so that might be a question. Does this person even like appreciate what's going on and understand, like, we're about to go to trial?
Right.
It could be because the person refuses to meet with the attorney, goes to talk to the attorney, gets irrationally angry and storms out. Not talking about Sarah Boone here. We'll talk about that later. But this person doesn't even seem able to sit in a chair for 30 seconds. How are they going to be in court? That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of walk through, and please interrupt me with other questions if you have them,
Mhm.
because I don't want to bore you to death. um, but I want to kind of walk through a little bit about what are we looking for when it comes to competency. So we get a full historical overview prior to even seeing the person. We get police reports. We get any records from past mental health treatment encounters. Um, any kind of past criminal history records. Usually we'll get something from like if there's department corrections, or the police have like a history with this
Mhm.
person. We get all of those documents, so we kind of know what we're walking into, whether or not mental health has played a role in other cases that they've had and that sort of thing. But we do a whole interview, so childhood history, mental health history, education, work. We kind of get to know this person as a whole, because we need to have context for what we're looking at now.
Mhm.
Now, the competency that I'm looking at is right now, what in this moment, seeing this client in with these charges, with this attorney, competency, that's all I'm evaluating. I'm not talking about their history of competency. Although, if they've had a previous evaluation done that I have access to, I may mention, well, they did have this other charge and they were found incompetent to stand trial before, but not as a determination of if they're competent now. So it's very important. The time is very important,
Mhm.
because people who with mental illness, their symptoms can wax and wane. So if mental illness symptoms are the reason why they're being referred, that 2 weeks ago they might have been doing pretty well and could talk about all this stuff, and now they've decompensated, which we do see with severe mental illness, because once someone's arrested and detained and they're sitting in jail, isolated, that's not good for people, especially with psychosis. So if they weren't already in an episode, they might be 2 weeks later when their attorney comes to talk to them. So we we kind of look at right now what's going on. So the things we're looking at is um, behavior. Are they going to be able to manage themselves in a courtroom? Are they going to be
Right.
standing up and yelling? Are they going to be able to sit down? Are they going to be able to understand that you don't speak until the judge asks you to, or like, this isn't your stage, that kind of thing? Do they understand that, and can they control themselves? Um, what's their understanding of like legal strategy? So how do they think their attorney should best defend them? What do they think, uh, what evidence is there available? Do they know about that? Also, sort of like the appraisal of their defense attorney. So far, how do you think your attorney's doing? You're kind of trying to see, is there any like paranoid ideation about the attorney that would
Mhm.
affect their ability, and then why particularly that attorney, or is it like all attorneys they believe are the
Mhm.
devil or something like that? So we want to know that they're going to be able to interact with their attorney appropriately and understand, um, sort of the facts of the case, what's going on. So communication with their attorney, can they sit down with their attorney and say, this is what I think happened, or this is what happened, and it's logical, it's reasonable, it's not based in delusion. There's some specific stuff about like amnesia, which is like a long kind of controversial topic about people that say they have amnesia and they can't remember the crime. But we kind of want to get an understanding of, like, can they sit down and have a conversation with their attorney about this in a way that makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
How do you think Lori value? Oh, yeah, I'll talk about that, Sonia. So a few more things real quick though. Just, do they appreciate the charges? Do they know what they're charged with? Do they know what that means? Do they know why those charges were selected based upon, what they're saying, what the police are saying happened? They get that. Do they appreciate what the seriousness of the crime? If it's a theft charge, do they think that they're going to get the death penalty? Or if they murdered someone, do they think, oh, I'll probably just get parole? And so you kind of want to get an idea of, like, how they're conceptualizing this and what the future potentially looks like. We also want to talk about, we want to find out from them sort of like, can they testify? Can they make the decision to testify? Is it, if they decide to testify, will they be able to get on the stand and help themselves, or are they
Right.
going to tank themselves? So I recently had somebody who was insistent upon testifying, and the attorney was like, I really think that she may not be competent because she doesn't, there's some other things too. Like, she doesn't seem to understand that this isn't like, this isn't kind of how court works, like, and that these charges are really serious, and she doesn't understand that she doesn't always make sense, but she's demanding that she get on the stand. And the attorney's like, she's going to destroy herself, essentially.
Yeah.
And so that kind of was the question. So we want to know, like, what are your reasons for wanting to testify? What would you say? What does it, and you're not trying to convince them one way or another. It's just about what's their conceptualization of it, and how will they present? Will that be helpful to them? Can they listen to their attorney who's saying, okay, I don't think this is a very good idea, and here's why. And can they do the risk benefit analysis to figure that out? So everybody has that reasoning ability.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, like, to testify relevantly, I guess I should say. And, just overall understanding the roles. So what's a judge? What do they do? What is a prosecuting attorney? What's a defense attorney? Who is the only person that can decide that you're going to testify? When can you speak out in court and when can you not? What's a jury? What's their role? So you kind of go through, and then you do, after, if they don't really give you a good answer on some of these, you'll say, like, well, this is what a jury is, or this is what a prosecuting attorney is. And then later you sort of check and see, all right, so I told you about that. Do you remember what the prosecutor is? And if they still can't tell you, that kind of gives you an indication of, like, are they able to learn this? Are they able to sort of incorporate some of this? So mental illness, obviously, is a big reason why people are referred for competency evaluation, but also intellectual ability. People with very low IQs. So we do IQ testing sometimes. We do psychological evaluations that include testing. So personality inventories hit on a lot of different symptoms that maybe we didn't ask about, or it gives us kind of a overarching view too, if they're trying to exaggerate their symptoms or not. How realistic is their presentation and what's in their self-report. So I've been talking a lot. So Lori Vallow. So it becomes difficult for the public to sort of speculate about why someone was found incompetent and then how they got restored, because we don't really know what the symptoms were. So if you have a person who, there's a wide range of outcomes here, right? So you can have a person with a mental illness, let's say a psychotic disorder, who's been unmedicated for a long time, and previously on medications, they functioned okay, right? So if you know this information, as a psychologist, you can, you do your whole evaluation, you say this person is not competent. to stand trial. And then you give an opinion sort of about whether or not restoration is possible. And you use a lot of history on that, but also we know kind of what prognoses are when it comes to various illnesses. But if somebody has a psychotic disorder, they've been medicated in the past successfully, the overarching thing is this isn't an IQ issue. This is they're delusional or they can't control their behavior. Then medication maybe is going to really help them. And then they get medicated. So the court will say, okay, competency restoration is going to include you're going to be at the state hospital for a reasonable amount of time to determine if competency restoration is possible. And they usually give the doctors like, every month you have to report or every 2 weeks or something to that effect. So what happens is they go to the hospital, they kind of have these like classes while they're there that teach them about the roles and things, but they're also medicated and provided treatment for whatever the illness is. And then they do a recheck, on competency. They do another evaluation, kind of see, are they able to grasp what's going on? Are they cleared up enough mentally that they can piece things together, participate in their defense in a reasonable way? And so once that happens, then the doctor lets the judge know competency has been restored, and then they move forward with trial. The cases where competency restoration does not appear to be likely are the hardest ones because we don't have a lot of options, and it varies state by state. Some states have, and some state, let me kind of back up a little bit. If people are not floridly psychotic, very active, but there's something going on that's making them incompetent. Maybe they just have a lower IQ, but they could learn about this stuff and figure it out, right? Some states have outpatient competency restoration. And so if they're out on bail or whatever, then they can go to these classes and do like the learning piece of it. Not all states have that. So that's really difficult because you can't send somebody who isn't severely mentally ill to a state hospital. You can't detain them in a state hospital, for long periods of time, even if it's someone with severe mental illness that's against their constitutional rights. I mean, they haven't been convicted of anything. And if they don't meet criteria for civil commitment, which means like you go to the hospital and you may be admitted involuntarily if you're a harm to yourself or others, like in that moment, it's imminent danger. If they don't meet criteria for that hospitalization, well, they don't meet criteria for state hospital. And so that becomes very tricky. So laws, have been in place. Various states are different of how long they're allowed to detain someone at a state hospital who's severely mentally ill for that restoration. So it's possible Lori, I don't know. I don't know if she was like actively symptomatic and needed medication. I don't know if it was a situation where she just didn't really know how all of this worked. And maybe had some strange ideas that interfered with her ability to understand that. But I think that's probably how she was restored through some intervention and combination of education and potentially medication. So Mandy, that's a great question. So Mandy's asking what happens if an inmate refuses medication. So it varies by state again, but if a psychologist tells the court this person is, incompetent due to psychosis, restoration is only likely with medication management, and the inmate says, no, I'm not. I'm not taking medication. You can send me to the state hospital. I'm not doing it. There are laws and they differ by state, but there are laws that the court can order forced medication, which is obviously not very preferred. But when you're looking at the risk-benefit analysis, if that person is not medicated, then they're never able to help in their own defense. And that is a constitutional right to be able to participate in your own defense. And so it's sort of like they're self-sabotaging by way of mental illness, like not on purpose is what I'm trying to say, but so they can. So the state hospital would need a court order to do that. And usually what that involves is having, they have to offer it, and they're not always at the state hospital. Sometimes they stay at the prison, but in the infirmary, and they can force court order forced medication that way as well. Because even state hospitals don't really like to have super violent psychotic people there. So if it's like a violence issue, a lot of times they'll just keep them at the prison and try to medicate them and then see, like, do some rechecks and see if they need to go to the hospital. But they need a court order, and so what they end up doing is the doctor, nurses, they offer the medication in several different ways. If the person still refuses, they're informed, if you refuse this, I have to give you a shot. And if they still refuse, then they're authorized to be restrained in order to administer the shot to them. So it's not a fun situation to have that happen, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So
in the case of Bianca, I mean, I've watched some of the videos with her. I mean, clearly, to me, not being an expert in that area, she clearly doesn't seem like she has her faculties to know what's going on right now, Rachel, at all.
no, she reminds me a lot of a few patients that I've seen. I don't know what it's like to interact with her specifically, but her presentation does remind me of someone who you truly just can't even really have a conversation with.
Yeah.
Her presentation to me says that she is extremely psychotic.
Yeah.
May not even be able to form like a coherent sentence to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually a little surprised that she was in court. I assume her behavior has been manageable, and that's why they allowed her to. But yeah,
Yeah.
and we'll see. Yeah, Mandy, I think I can see that. You ask a question, the response is something that has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, definitely.
It makes sense to them and what they're experiencing internally, but it makes no sense to anyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you. So regarding the testing, do they ever try to go down the road of getting a second opinion for competency at all? Is that something they can do, or how does that work? Like if they
They
don't agree
can.
with one ruling, can they go for a second opinion?
So the defense typically doesn't do that because they're not going to want to spend the money, number one,
Right.
and so what? Usually, the second evaluation is by the prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I guess I think I haven't seen a situation where a defense attorney has disagreed with the psychologist.
Yeah.
We're pretty trained to be able to explain why we're opining the way that we are.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't really think that's very common to have them
Okay.
like look for someone who will say they're incompetent. Um, I think maybe you would get that if you were going for an insanity defense, which is
Mm-hmm.
different. But here's the problem. So if a report is written for a defense attorney, even if they don't use that, in some states, in some circumstances, it can still be discoverable. So they don't want documents created that they're not going to use in court.
Okay.
So potentially they could consult with more than one psychologist to say, like, what do you think? Do you think this might be, and if they're not happy with it, I mean, I don't know how often that happens, but yeah.
Yeah.
So Mandy, someone said to me once, it just like makes so much sense. Psychosis, severe mental illness, the organ of that disease is the brain. And the brain is the organ that produces reason, logic. So when it doesn't mean that all of the brain is disordered, it doesn't mean they can't understand anything. It's a very fluid situation. We don't know when they're hearing voices, when those voices have quieted for a moment. You know, it's such a mystery still how these
Mm-hmm.
illnesses manifest.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be a moment of fluidity and lucidity where they seem like, oh yeah, like I know the answer to that, but then very quickly the stimuli starts again.
Very
So it can be a
interesting.
really interesting thing, which is why it's important to spend a lot of time with these people before you opine on anything. So these are not quick evaluations by any
Yeah.
means in terms of the length of the actual evaluation. So
So, Rachel, you talked about IQ being one of the issues potentially
mhm.
for them. So, is there a cutoff on IQ in terms of, how low does it have to be before they say, this person is not competent, or
Mhm.
is it case by case?
So that's a great question. We don't diagnose intellectual disability just with an IQ. You have to also do what's called a functional assessment of,
Mhm.
like what kinds of things are they capable of doing? Like what have they learned to do? How have they adapted? Do they shower themselves? Do they hold a job? Do they, cook
Mhm.
their own food? Like you can have someone with a fairly low IQ who's able to do these adaptive functioning things.
Mhm.
And that plays into what you ultimately say their level of severity is. So we don't use a number as a cutoff. It's just information. It's a data point.
Yeah, makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
very cool.
yeah.
So,
Uh,
yeah,
the
do
judge,
we
in her initial appearance, the judge disappointed me by not defining the word indictment for Bianca. Oh, Mandy, were you saying because she didn't? Did she express that she didn't understand that? Because I didn't see that part. Um, Yeah, I mean, so I'm not sure why he wouldn't at least say, this is what the indictment is. Unless he didn't want to get into this pattern of her not knowing what anything is and him having to explain every single thing. But
Sure.
it seems like, yeah, you'd be able to say, well, this is the document that explains what the reasons why they think you're here today,
Mhm.
something to that.
Mhm.
And she said, I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, and so and then that probably was more information for her attorney to say, okay, she doesn't really even understand what's going on. I mean, she might know what an indictment is, she just doesn't know it's called an indictment, if that makes sense. So that's some of the stuff that we try to figure out with them is, they might not know what. Sometimes I've had people say, I'll say, what is the prosecutor? What does the prosecuting attorney do? And they're like, what's an attorney? I'm like, the
Mhm.
lawyer. They're like, oh, oh, oh. You know what I mean? And so
Mhm.
sometimes, yeah. So I don't know. It's sometimes that's interesting that the judge wouldn't try to check in on that, but um, rule out malingering during the competency eval. So that's a really good question. Um, it's really hard to fake incompetency. It's
Yeah.
very hard because what people don't understand is that we're not looking at just what you're saying to us. We're talking, we talk to collateral informants. So we talk to like family members, employers, like people who know these people also. We look at past records. We know how they typically present. So if they're all of a sudden, like if you have somebody who, I don't know, got their master's degree and in literature, and then all of a sudden they don't know what the word attorney is. It's like,
Right.
and there's been no like brain injury, there's been no severe, like there's no psychosis. Even in psychosis, people still know what words mean.
Mhm.
And so that's people, it's very hard. Would be very hard to fake that. Even on the tests that we give, there are validity scales built in to tell us if someone is exaggerating or trying to make themselves look better than they actually are. So that would be it's very hard during a 4 to 5 hour interview to stay consistently incompetent. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. That's a
So
really good question.
I'm gonna jump to the other case for a sec, Rachel. Just
Yeah.
yeah. So the case of Tyler Daisy, it's a Dubuque, Iowa case where
Mhm.
he murdered his mother and also his mother's dog. I think with a hatchet. I'm not positive on that, but
Yes.
it happened in January of this year, and he essentially murdered his mother because he was convinced that she was practicing witchcraft. And he wrote this weird note about, not wanting to participate in his trial himself, not wanting to be present in the trial, equating that to slavery, essentially, is what he wrote in the note.
Mhm.
So he chose not to attend his own trial. So talk about that case a little bit on what your thoughts are with
Yeah.
him.
And, and I believe he's initially found incompetent to stand trial. So but he is competent now. So he's not attending because he's incompetent. They can't do that. Like this is just a separate, since competency was restored, that's a choice that he's made, and that's okay. So that has nothing to do with the competency piece of it. But this man was showing, obvious symptoms of psychosis and had a diagnosis of schizophrenia previously, and was very symptomatic when arrested. And some of his behaviors, with the police were very. I mean, he was urinating several times in his Tyvek suit, like even though he was offered to go use the bathroom. So there was a lot of behavioral issues there, a lot of delusional thought process, and so initially was found incompetent. But I imagine, and we don't get to know this, but I do imagine that he was restored through medication and treatment, to a point where he could understand well enough to know what the process was and participate in his defense. So, and that doesn't mean these people aren't still going to be difficult sometimes.
Right.
It's about their knowledge and understanding, and if they can participate, it doesn't mean that they're going to be easy to work with necessarily.
Mhm.
So yeah, and what I find really interesting about this case, and I've heard a lot of people asking, is why in the world did they not use an insanity defense for this
Right.
guy? Like you're listening to the testimony, and you're like, even lay people can say this guy was really mentally ill, like he was psychotic. This was based in delusion. This was so. Insanity is different from competency. Competency just has to do with their ability to participate in the process. It has nothing to do with the actual crime.
Right.
And so, with an insanity defense, that has to do with the strategy the defense is using in the trial, and it's based upon the mental state of the individual at the time of the crime. So, not what's happening now. Maybe they were competent then, but insane. Maybe
Hmm.
they were not insane, but they were incompetent. Like those things don't necessarily are necessarily in tandem with one another. And so this man being very symptomatic, people can be very symptomatic and still not be insane. So insanity is a legal term. It's not a psychological term. It's a legal term that talks about the mental state at the time of the crime. They were able to appreciate the wrongfulness of what they were doing, and if they were aware of what they were doing, or were they so impaired that they were not able to use reason, judgment, and to understand
Hmm.
that. I don't know if you'll remember, but the James Holmes, the man who shot a lot of people in the movie theater, was
Yes.
very psychotic during the time leading up to the crime, during the crime, but he was found guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity. So and there were different opinions from different psychologists about that. So this, I would probably bet a lot of money on the idea that the defense explored an insanity defense here, and that
Hmm.
they had him evaluated before they made a decision about whether or not to use that defense. And I would imagine that they didn't use that defense because the evaluation came back saying, like, he was symptomatic, but he totally knew this was wrong, and he knew what he was doing, and it might have been based in a psychotic belief, but he knew it was wrong. He
Hmm.
appreciated what he was doing. He wanted her to die. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I would imagine that that's the case, because he was obviously very ill at the time.
Yeah.
Um, this
Yeah.
seems like this seems like a case where it would be like, oh, this is totally an insanity defense, but it's not always that simple.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. That brings another case to mind too, and it may be um, not really appropriate to our discussion right now on what we're talking about, but I just kind of wanted to look down the road a little bit at Chad Dorman, which is coming up, Rachel.
Well, it is
The
relevant to this. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it kind of is too. So I kind of misspoke there, but yeah, he's accused of murdering his three children in front of his wife. He spared his stepdaughter. He basically ran them down in the yard, killed them all, and then sat down on the steps with his rifle and waited for the police to get there. Now, he originally claimed insanity That's going to be very interesting where that goes now, because he also told police in his interview that he had planned 8 months in advance to do what he did. And the reason that's going to become interesting is because that's now been thrown out because they didn't
Yeah, we know
properly
that.
Mirandize him. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So what do you think on that case, Rachel?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we know that, but the jury's not gonna know that.
True.
Which is so it's gonna make it a hard trial to watch, I think, in some ways because of that, because it's like, oh, it's such a big piece of information, but you can't, it's hard,
Yeah.
you can't present that. And so the person who gets to evaluate Chad Doraman is going to gather a ton of history on him. If he's claiming insanity due to psychosis or whatever, do you know how old he was or
I'm
how
not
old
sure
he
how
is?
old I'm not sure, actually. I want to say in his late 30s, but
Yeah.
I'm not positive.
Okay. Yeah. So right off the bat, a person in their late 30s, especially a male, it is extremely rare for them to have a psychotic break out of nowhere with no history whatsoever of illness or anything else having happened in the past. Like these sort of just like, oh, I snapped kind of situation. Well, we know he even said he wasn't a snap, he had planned it. But, so the person evaluating him is going to have a lot of historical information. And if there isn't historical information, that's going to play a factor into this, I think. There's going to have to be a
32. Sorry.
32. Okay, still, I
32.
mean, that's still kind of beyond, I mean, for that serious of a psychotic break,
Hmm.
that's pretty
Hmm.
odd for to be early 30s. So they're going to look at drug use, they're going to look at his behaviors in the weeks, months leading up to this. They're going to evaluate, his current state. They're going to look at so much information to see how consistent these symptoms were, how that but their determination is at the time of the crime, but the context of all of that is the
Yeah.
leading up to and just after. And so they're going to talk to tons of family members. They're going to talk to almost any provider he's ever seen.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, I imagine that in order to, I imagine that they've already consulted with someone that they have that's
Hmm.
going to say he was insane at the time of the crime, because I think especially in a case like this, would be very rare to have somebody, to have them not really know what a professional would say before
Yeah.
they declare that as their defense.
Yeah.
Um, so there's somebody who said, but the prosecution they will evaluate him also.
Yeah.
They will have their experts evaluate him as well. So it's always a battle of the experts in those cases.
Absolutely.
You don't put on that defense without knowing you have someone to say that that's legit.
Absolutely.
So
Such a frustrating case, from a police perspective too,
yeah.
because, they just totally blew it. I mean, he essentially said to them in the interview, where's my attorney or something along those lines, which
Mhm.
should have led them to realize that, hey, this guy wants an attorney. And, it wasn't provided. And so all of that stuff that he threw out is going to not be allowed to come in during trial, it appears. So,
I almost wish we
yeah.
didn't know. It's like
Yeah,
watching from the outside. You're like,
yeah.
"Ugh,
I mean, I still think he'll be found guilty even without that stuff because hello, he did it right in front of
mm,
his wife, and she'll be one of the first people to
yeah."
testify. So, yeah.
And these are
Anyway,
children. I
correct.
think that makes a big difference to a jury too. These are children, 3 children.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, horrific.
Yeah.
But it will be one to watch, and to, if we can get through the horrible testimony of the facts of the case. The
Mhm.
experts will definitely be ones to watch. And it's funny because you've got, you know, I'm very careful. I don't bash other experts. I try to be really careful about that because,
Mhm.
we don't know all the information they had, even when they're saying, "Oh, I had this, this." We don't really know, and we don't. I think, as a general statement, experts don't care who's paying them for what. Um, you just you get paid for the work that you do, regardless.
Mhm.
So I think it's important to say this actually. So if I take an evaluation, I get paid to do that evaluation, whether the results are ones the attorney likes or not. And
Mhm.
so it doesn't matter to me what the results end up being. There's no incentive unless someone wanted, had some crazy testimony fee that they wanted to make sure that they could get, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
after the
Yeah.
fact. But it's largely, I would say, it's because I see people in the public a lot of times, they see experts and they're like, well, obviously they said that they were paid this, that, and the other. Well, no,
Mhm.
they got paid no matter what. They're getting paid extra for their testimony, of course, because now it's what they want to use, but you just won't be used if you don't give them the results that they were hoping for.
I see.
And that's okay, because trust me, all of these people have plenty of work. They don't
Mhm.
need to testify for every case that they take. And honestly, I can say for myself, like, I don't want a high profile case. I
Mhm.
don't want to be on TV testifying. I don't want that pressure and scrutiny. So I don't know how other people feel. I'm sure maybe there's people that really want that notoriety or whatever. But I mean, you're
Mhm.
also putting yourself out there for some serious scrutiny. So coming from my perspective, I think, when you're involved in these cases, it's not you're not really doing it. You're not trying to appease the attorney. And
Mhm.
and a lot of times people will ask, well, how many times have you testified for the prosecution? How many times for the defense? Well, part of the reason for that is because typically you have a contract with an office.
Mhm.
So it's not about like, oh, I will only testify for a defense case because I always say that they're not guilty. I always say it's not like that. It's just they've chosen to use you in the contract, and then those cases that you guys align on, they use you in court. So I hope that gives people a little bit of perspective on that. Um,
Yeah.
of course, you have the case with Letitia Stout,
Mhm.
who murdered her stepson, and
Right.
she pled not guilty by reason of insanity. And of course, it's a total flop. And she did find a psychologist who said, yeah, she's absolutely not guilty. And they wouldn't have found anybody else. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
They wouldn't
Yeah.
have found anybody else. And there are a lot of issues with that. It could probably be another show. And like I said, I don't like to bash other professionals, but you do come across one from time to time that's like, it's
Sure.
not that's not
It's
the
like
way it should go.
yeah, it's like anything else, It's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Mhm.
What other cases come to your mind if I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there other cases
Well,
that
I'm
come
trying
to
to think.
mind? Yeah, that where competency has been an issue? I was
And
racking my brain. I
yeah,
can't think of any more right off the get-go.
yeah, recently I can't really think of
Yeah.
any other than
Yeah.
the ones we've talked about. If anybody
Uh-huh.
watching can think of other ones, but yeah, Mandy, that was Dr. Otnow Lewis. And I'll tell you a little story about that actually, because when I was in high school, like I knew that this is what I wanted to do for a living. So I would read all kinds of books. And I read her book, Not Guilty by Reason of Insanity. And I loved it. It was great. It was a great book. It was a great perspective. It talked a lot about the neurological differences in people who commit violent crime, and that is true. I mean, some of that stuff is very true. Um, she wasn't like big into the multiple personality disorder situation at that point, I don't think. But back in the day, I actually remember reaching out to her in a research project I did for my senior year of high school, and I like thought she was the coolest. And so then when I saw her name pop up for that trial, I was like, "Oh," and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, she's a quack, whatever." And I was like, "No, man, that's Dorothy Otnow Lewis." So I was like, "She's cool, whatever." And then when I just was I was so deflated. And then I realized from the time I was in high school till now what's been happening, and what she's done with her work, and then saw the documentary and the trial, and I was like, no, it was like I was like personally embarrassed. I wanted to like crawl under the table watching. I'm like, this is not how we are. I Please don't put me in that umbrella. I swear. No, that was wild. That was
Yeah.
wild. That's my story about that. Oh, yeah, yeah. Teacher
Yeah.
trial gave me trauma too.
Yeah.
Any other questions, man? I feel like I've just been bleh,
No, it's been really
blubbering your
interesting.
ears off.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
hope
I've learned
so.
stuff, and I'm sure the people
Cool.
watching have too. Yeah, it's been really good.
We could talk about people who, briefly, and it's not like I have a lot of solution for this, but people whose competency is not restorable. is a very tricky issue. So if somebody does have a very low IQ, poor adaptive functioning, it's a neurologic thing, it's not going to get better.
Hmm.
That's luckily we have very, very few cases of super violent offenders who are in that situation without being able to be restored, thank goodness.
Hmm.
But what happens is, the judge can do whatever the judge wants to do as far as, even if I say I don't think this can be restorable, they can still try to get competency restored. But if it's an ongoing thing where it's just not going to happen, a lot of times the charges are just dropped. Um, because the situation with incompetency is like even plea agreements. You can't, if a person's incompetent, they can't participate in their plea agreement
Right.
effectively and reasonably. And so you can't even be like, okay, well, we'll give them probation at least. No, because they
Yeah.
can't agree to that or disagree to that. So it's hard. A lot of times the charges are just dismissed. Um, and that's, okay sometimes when it comes to like,
Hmm.
theft or I don't know, um,
Yeah.
you know, some kind of like mild harassment or something like that. But if it
Hmm.
comes to a murder charge, that's a really tough thing um, to get
Well, yeah,
around.
that's a whole can of worms because you've got essentially somebody who really can't be restored that is walking around, and
Hmm.
um,
Yeah. And for the
yeah,
victims and their families, I mean, that's awful. Like, so this person just did this and now they like, there's nothing's going to happen to them. And
yeah.
then it's a very rare situation.
I was gonna say it's got to be a really small percentage, Rachel.
It is, and some states have laws where the judge can at least civilly commit them for
Okay.
treatment, and regardless, but it's like when the treatment is a failure is where it becomes really, really tricky.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm. What
yeah.
about what about where you're located on the East Coast? Do you guys have that in place where the judge can do civil stuff or not?
I don't believe so. I don't
Okay.
believe so. Again, these cases are so rare. I mean, I don't even know if I could think of one
Hmm.
where that's happened. I mean, I've had cases where they dropped the charges because the person
Hmm.
is incompetent and not restorable. Luckily, at these times, the state will at times intervene to at least set up some kind of appropriate community treatment. I've had a guy that sort of needed residential treatment, so at least they had some kind of structure they were going to
Yeah.
manage symptoms and things like that. But yeah, it becomes really kind of scary.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so, like, I would love to know, and we probably won't ever know, but I would be so curious to know what Bianca's like history is and criminal history is and how things have been.
Hmm.
For all we know, she's been found incompetent in the past and they haven't been able to proceed with trials. Like, I don't know, but there is a
Yeah.
long history of mental health issues. And I would assume probably criminal behavior, if at the very least, just minor things. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I did read in researching this morning a little bit more on Bianca Ellis. Back to her, I did read that she apparently, according to what I read, has no violent history in her past.
Mm, wow.
So I found that very interesting. That just kind of blows me away. How somebody can just make that decision in that moment to just, picked out those people,
Yeah.
followed them into the parking lot and did what she did and then just walks away. It blows me away that that can happen.
Yeah, I don't know if I would 100% believe that either, but
Mhm.
maybe maybe nothing documented.
Yeah,
But
true.
also, we don't know. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know what well, we don't know drug use for one thing. We don't know if she has neurologic impairment, if she's been using drugs, if we don't know anything about what else might have been affecting her at that particular moment. If somebody is already psychotic and then they use crack cocaine or, we don't know about that. Oh, Shonda Vander Ark, is that who you're
Mhm. I
referring
think
to?
so, yes.
But real quick, so and we don't know what the content of her delusions or like hallucinations were. I mean, it's like a whole. There's so many factors that go into when that happens, and somebody. I mean, she obviously had some kind of fixed belief about it that
Yeah.
she was compelled to do that. So Yeah, Shonda Vander Ark. What specifically? What do I think about? What about her? What do I think about her diagnostically? What do I think about her? Like, she's not psychotic. I can tell you that. Believe she's very personality disordered. Um, she struck me as being a little on the spectrum, but I don't know that. Um, there's something off about her.
Mhm.
She's a psychopath. I mean, um, her capacity for empathy is obviously very low, if
Mhm.
not absent. But I don't know
Yes.
what else you want to know what I think about her.
Sonia saying yes, diagnostic is what her response to
Yeah,
your question was. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I just think that's a
Oh.
mixed personality bag, um, but certainly not. She didn't present as psychotic. She's very much also knew what she was doing.
Mhm.
Admittedly, knew she was sending
Mhm.
those texts and what her thought process was about it and all of that. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, she was something else. She's very expressionless until she needed to be expressive,
Yeah.
like when she pretended to throw up in the trash can. So that was interesting. That was an
Mhm.
interesting one to watch, and then didn't show up. I remember this is gonna be one of those moments where, like, you're like, "Where were you when JFK was shot?" Well, I remember where I was when Shonda fake threw up in the trash can. Those are the moments that I remember. It's so stupid. Ah, but that's what yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anybody else? Any other
Yeah.
questions? I'll bill you all for tuition after this for my class. Yeah,
We're about at the hour place. So yeah,
yeah.
I really appreciate you doing this today, Rachel. I mean, it's been really informative, and I know
Thank
that
you.
yeah, you're welcome. I know that our audience here has probably learned some stuff, and I'm sure that the people that watch down the
Yay.
road will as well. So yeah,
Yay. Cool.
yeah,
And I was actually listening to an attorney talk about these issues before, and I was like, oh, we really have a different like spin on this. So, I mean, I think it's cool to hear this from different, because the legal perspective is different from the psychologist,
hmm,
um, in some ways. Like we understand it as the same thing, but the way it's talked about is different. So I hope this was like added to whatever else you've heard about it. It's cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna be back. I'll just share this with the people that are in the
Yeah.
chat right now. We're gonna be back on Monday, this coming Monday. I
Mhm.
think is it 2 o'clock Eastern, Rachel? I think that
I
sounds right.
believe so.
I'll put out the promo, but we're gonna have a guest. Her name is Sunny, and I'm blanking on Sunny's name right now. I'm so sorry. Sunny Slaughter. There we go. We
Mhm.
haven't had Sunny on before. Sunny's a law enforcement analyst with a huge amount of experience. She travels all over the country and does speaking engagements and that sort of thing. Sunny's agreed to come on and talk about women, specifically women in the court system and in the prison system and how they cope in the prison system. And she's written some papers on that. So we thought it was actually Rachel's idea. She thought it was a wonderful topic to put out there with women in prison. So we're going to do that. So Sunny will be here on Monday. And that will be it for that week. I'm going to be out of town for a while, and so is Rachel. So we'll be
Yeah.
back, I guess, the following week with some stuff after that.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
yeah,
Thank
should
you
be
guys for
fun.
being here.
Yeah, thank you guys. We appreciate all of
All
you
right.
showing up and all your questions, and
Yes.
we will see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah. Have a great weekend, guys. Bye.
Thanks, guys.